Welcome back to the channel, guys. It is summertime bass fishing and we're going to talk about one of my favorite baits that I absolutely love to throw every year, especially in the summer, but it's a great spring and fall bait as well. And that's going to be the Carolina rig. So we're going to break down a couple of the mistakes I used to make with a Carolina rig, some pretty common ones that are out there. We're going to show you 3 of them that you don't want to make with your Carolina rig, how to fix them. Basically what we're going to do is we're going to show you how to rig up your Carolina rig here and the things that I used to make a mistake on while I was rigging it up. So we got 3 of them to run through here. Stay tuned and let's get into it. By the end of today's video, you'll be catching more fish on a Carolina rig just by changing your setup like this. So let's get right into it. So as you can see, we already have our Carolina rig on here and ready to roll, but we're gonna cut this off and start over from fresh just so you can see exactly what we're talking about here. We're actually getting ready to go to the St. Lawrence River on Friday, and a Carolina rig is a major player up there, which you wouldn't think on smallmouth, but we'll talk about that in one of our mistakes later today. But we're gonna rig up a fresh one ready to go up there. So first we're gonna start by cutting this guy off. You would think this is a fairly easy technique just to rig up. You literally just tie your weight and your bead up there and then put a swivel on and then you're good to go. And then you have your leader down to your hook. But there's a few little things that I've kind of learned over the years that have actually helped me catch more fish on my Carolina rig. So what we're gonna need before we get started here, you're gonna need your swivel. So I buy, they're called barrel swivels. They have like a little roller barrel in the middle, and there are 2 closed loops on each side, and that's it. That's all you want. You want it big enough so that your bead won't slide over it. So I don't actually know exactly what size those are. I usually go, they have like their break strength is where they break at. Usually somewhere in that like 40 to 60 pound break strength is what I'm looking for in a barrel swivel. I don't know what size that is. It might vary by company. I'm not exactly positive on how that works, but that's what I've always used as a rule of thumb. The other thing you're gonna need is a bead. Now, this is gonna be mistake number 1 right here. So don't use a glass bead with tungsten. You can use a glass bead with lead, and basically it's going to come down to how you want to rig up your Carolina rig. So I have rigged them up with both. I will carry tungsten weights. I have them right here, 1/2 ounce tungsten, and you can slide that on there and you'll feel everything. So this right here, I have a 1/2 ounce tungsten and a 1/2 ounce lead sinker, and they're way different there in size. Hugely different, but you'll feel more with that tungsten. And if you need to feel more, that's key. If you're fishing in grass, that's when I like to use this one. So if you're fishing around a lot of grass, I'll use a bullet tungsten and I'll be pulling it through the grass so that it doesn't get snagged as much. And then if you get it on that small hard spot, which is usually what you're fishing outside of those grass areas, you'll be able to feel it a lot better. So that's when I'll go with this. Now, if I'm going to a place like the St. Lawrence River, you will lose your life savings in tungsten dragging it in those giant boulders and rocks down there. So I'll go to lead because 1, you're gonna feel everything down there anyway. These boulders are huge. So it's not like you're trying to feel a little sand patch outside of a grass flat. You're just feeling for giant boulders down there, and you'll know because your bait's gonna get stuck in it. So I'll go to lead, they're much cheaper. We're actually gonna upsize our lead for this event, and we're gonna go to a 3/4 ounce, but that was a 1/2 ounce there. We're gonna be fishing really deep on the St. Lawrence. Now, when I was talking about the bead, if you use lead in glass, it will make that clicking sound that you want, but it will not break your bead. If you throw tungsten and glass on here, the first thing you set the hook on, you're shattering that bead, and the bead will be glass. So what will happen is, I've done it before, you'll put a tungsten weight and a glass bead on there, you'll set the hook on a fish, and you'll snap off and you'll never wonder why. So every single time you're snapping off, you're snapping that bead, shattering it, and it's just cutting your line. So every time that happens, the glass bead is just cutting through your line, or it could nick your line, you'll break off 3 fish later, or something like that. So when you go lead, use a glass bead. When you go tungsten, get a brass bead or other type of metal. They even make tungsten beads now. So get a tungsten bead, get something like that. You won't break that and you'll still get the sound, but you cannot use a glass bead with tungsten. That's like my biggest mistake I used to make. I would break fish off all the time solely because you're using a glass bead with tungsten. So starting there, we got our weight on and we got our bead. So that was mistake number 1 while you're rigging up. Now, you have this on here We just slide that up the line. Most people would go ahead and just tie their swivel on, and that's the way that I used to do it. But there's a couple things that you need to do in the process here that will ensure your Carolina rig is stronger and make sure you don't break as many fish off. So the first thing I'm going to do, this is mistake number 2, add a buffer on your Carolina rig. So right here we have bobber stops. So if you have that bead just slam against your knot that's going to be on the swivel there, you can break off a lot. This is actually something that a lot of catfish guys do, and we use them for bobber stops to hold our Texas rig weights up against our bait. But if you take this and put it on just like you would for a Texas rig, but after you've already put your weight and bead up there, when you tie your swivel on down here, this is going to sit against your knot. Your knot will be down below this, and it'll have just enough cushion on that rubber there. When you set the hook, it's not going to smash into your weight and your knot and break off. So that's 2 reasons why you'll break fish off right there. So you'll either break them off from the glass bead against tungsten, or with this bobber stop right here. If you skip that, you'll break some fish off doing that as well. So mistake 1 and 2, before you even tie your swivel on, make sure you pick the right bead and make sure you use a bobber stop, and you'll be in good shape just by doing that alone. So now let's jump into mistake number 3 on how to tie your bait up here and what type of leader you should be using. So now mistake number 3, again, you're gonna wanna just tie your swivel on here and then tie your leader on, but you can do this in a little bit backward step and it'll make sure your bait is a little bit stronger. So we're actually gonna set this side down for now, and one of the mistakes is going to be your leader selection. My biggest thing that I used to do in the past, I would just pull off like 3 to 4 foot of line off my reel, tie the same thing right on there. And I always use straight 17-pound test fluorocarbon on my Carolina rig rod. The problem is, 1, you're fishing fluorocarbon, so your bait's gonna actually sink and it's not gonna suspend up in the water column. Your bait will never float. So even using mono, if you put mono on here, your bait will not float at a 90-degree angle up on the bottom. It's not a bobber. But if you throw fluorocarbon, your bait's gonna sink all the way to the bottom and just drag on the bottom. If you throw mono, it's gonna gently flutter above the bottom and look a lot more natural. It's gonna have a different look to it. So the other thing I'll do, 1, pick mono. So I get this spool of Suffolk's Advanced Mono. I keep one with me for my drop shot fluorocarbon leaders and stuff. I'll keep this in here for when I throw a Carolina rig. And then, like I said, I throw straight 17-pound test fluorocarbon. I buy 14-pound test monofilament, so I'll throw 1 size down from what I'm gonna throw on my main rig. And that will save you so much time, because if you get your bait hung up down there, it will break at your hook and you'll just tie a new hook on. But if you had 17 to 17 to 17 and it was all the same and you hang up your hook, you might break it at your weight up there, and then you gotta retie the whole setup. So you don't wanna do that. You wanna use 1 size down from what you're planning on using. So we'll take our 14-pound test mono, and you'll notice this is the leader. We set aside our setup with the weight and the bead so far. What I'll do with my leader is I'll actually tie it on first so that I can use Palomars on the entire setup. So I'll go through my swivel as I would with any other Palomar. I'll just go ahead and basically you're just Palomar knotting 1 side of this swivel on like you were gonna tie your leader on already, or your end of your other line. So I'll tie this on. Since you have to go around the entire bait or swivel or whatever you're tying on, if you tie the other main line end on first, you can't go around your entire rod and reel to put your Palomar knot on. But if you put your Palomar knot on just this small swivel, then you pull off your section of fluorocarbon or your mono. So I'll have about 4 or 5 foot is usually where I go there. And now I have a leader tied to a swivel and nothing on it. I don't even have the hook on it yet. What I'll then do is I'll take my main line that I have over here with all my weight and bead and everything on there. And if you tie your Palomar knot on this side, when you tie it, you've already tied the Palomar on your leader side, now you're tying your main line, you can do that small little loop, and when you pull the swivel through, you just pull all this tag right through there, and you just put a Palomar on both sides of your knot now. And I'll go ahead and cinch that down as tight as I can. And now I have Palomar knots on both sides of my swivel. So that's my favorite knot. It holds tight, and I very rarely break a Palomar knot off. I'll slide my cushion up against that knot, so that's not going to get slammed by the weight and bead. I have a Palomar knot to a Palomar knot, and then I can come down here however far I want to put my bait and tie another Palomar knot. And then I have 3 Palomar knots and nothing's gonna break. So I trust that this is gonna hold up the best. I've cushioned my knot up here. I've used the correct bead. So now all that comes is your hook and your bait selection. So the last thing, biggest mistake I've made with the Carolina rig is not changing up your bait selection enough. So weight or leader length doesn't really matter. It does matter, but it depends on your scenario. So if you're fishing in the summer, you want a longer leader. If you're fishing in the spring, you want a shorter leader. If you're fishing grass, you might want a shorter leader to get it through the grass a little bit better. It all depends. So play around with that. I'm gonna cut a leader probably about 3 foot here for going up to the St. Lawrence River. And then I'm gonna I have a 2/0 extra wide gap hook is what I'm gonna rig up here because I'm gonna be choosing a bait dedicated for smallmouth bass. Where, like I said, your bait selection, that was one of my biggest mistakes over the years. I would only fish like a lizard on a Carolina rig. And that's like the only thing I would throw because that's all you ever really see with a Carolina rig. Well, the Carolina rig is probably one of the most versatile baits that you can throw. And you can basically mimic any type of forage, catch any type of fish, all by changing your bait selection. So we're going up to the St. Lawrence, and those fish eat on a lot of craws, gobies, stuff like that, and they're smallmouth bass. So we're gonna take a Zoom Ultra Vibe Speed Craw here. That's why I have the 2/0 hook. And we're gonna rig up just a Zoom Ultra Vibe Speed Craw as my bait here with a small profile. It looks like a craw. We can keep it down there on the bottom. And that's the way we're gonna approach that for smallmouth bass. Now you can use this for largemouth too. There's nothing wrong with putting that on there for largemouth. But you can change your hook and weight size to do different things or your bait selection. So that's what I'm gonna choose for, say, a smallmouth bass. But my old go-to, like I said, was the lizard. So like the 6th Sense Hog Walla was basically the only thing I would throw, or a regular Zoom lizard, any of that stuff. That's what I'd throw for largemouth bass. But I've quickly learned that a couple of my other favorites are like a Zoom Speed Worm, has just a little bit of action in the tail, but it gets a ton of bites because it's just a worm. Or even the 6th Sense Clout or any other stick worm. Huge, one of my favorite baits to throw on a Carolina rig. It just gets bites whenever you need it. You can throw other types of craw imitations. If you want to get a bigger bite, you can throw a 10-inch curly tail worm on there instead of putting it on like a Texas rig and fish that offshore. Or if your fish are feeding on shad, you can go with a fluke on there and twitch it down there on the bottom and get a fluke down way deeper than you ever could and get bites way offshore with a fluke that fish are feeding on shad. You can even take this speed craw and switch that out for like a baby brush hog or something and put it on a bigger hook and fish for largemouth. It just really depends. So you got to mimic what your fish are feeding on, figure that out. If they're feeding on bluegills, craws, stuff like that, you'll want to use your craw imitations. You'll want to use your lizard imitations for like, I know that doesn't look like a bluegill, but that bigger profile in bluegill colors can really mimic that down there. If you're just trying to get bites, you can go with those straight tail smaller worms and get bites doing that. If they're feeding on shad, you can go with this fluke and catch them doing that. So it's the most versatile bait ever, but I never really was versatile with it. I would only use lizards and that was it. Once I learned and started experimenting with different bait choices down there, given the scenario, I started catching way more fish on a Carolina rig. So I know that was a pretty comprehensive video of how to rig this thing up and all the different things you can do with a Carolina rig. If you want to see this bait in action, learn how and where to fish it, showing you different places offshore, check this video out right here. Hope you enjoyed it. Hit that subscribe button down below so you don't miss any more of my fishing tips coming up. Thanks for watching.